In the shadow of Istanbul's towering minarets, beneath the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace, a single night in 1534 would unleash a revolution that European courts could never have imagined. What began as whispered preparations in the imperial harem would shatter 5 sacred laws that had governed the Ottoman Empire for over 2 centuries. The woman at the center of this upheaval was no princess, no noble daughter of kings. She was a Ukrainian slave girl who had mastered the deadliest game of all, transforming absolute submission into absolute power. Tonight, we descend into the forbidden chambers where Hurrem Sultan orchestrated the most audacious coup in Ottoman history. A coup executed not with armies or assassins, but with silk, perfume, and the calculated breaking of every rule that had kept the empire's women in chains. What you're about to discover will forever change how you understand power, desire, and the hidden forces that reshape civilizations from within palace walls. But before we unlock these secrets, I need something from you. If you're fascinated by the dark corners of imperial history as much as I am, prove it by hitting that like button right now. That simple action helps me continue digging up these buried stories that textbooks refuse to tell. And here's where you decide our next journey into the shadows. Drop a comment naming any queen, empress, or forgotten woman of power whose forbidden tale you want exposed. The most requested name becomes our next investigation into history's most dangerous secrets. Will it be betrayal, revenge, or forbidden passion? That choice belongs to you. If you haven't already, subscribe and ring that notification bell, because what follows about Hurrem's wedding night will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the Ottoman Empire. The year 1520 had brought Suleiman to the throne of an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of Yemen. Constantinople glittered as the crossroads of 3 continents, where merchants from Venice competed with traders from Cairo, and diplomatic envoys from distant kingdoms sought audiences with the Sultan, who commanded more wealth than any European monarch. Yet within the gilded halls of Topkapi Palace, ancient traditions maintained a delicate equilibrium that had preserved Ottoman power for generations. These weren't mere customs or suggestions. They were iron laws forged in blood and enforced with the swift justice of the executioner's blade. The first sacred rule declared that no concubine could bear more than 1 son to the Sultan, ensuring that no single woman could accumulate dynastic power through multiple heirs. The second law prohibited any sultan from marrying a slave, reserving royal marriages exclusively for foreign princesses who could cement diplomatic alliances. The third commandment barred women from residing within Topkapi itself, the beating heart of imperial governance, keeping feminine influence safely separated from matters of state. The fourth tradition established rigid hierarchies within the harem that could never be altered, each woman knowing precisely her place in the complex web of imperial favor. And the fifth, perhaps most crucial of all, absolutely forbade women from participating in councils of war, diplomacy, or any aspect of imperial administration. These 5 pillars had weathered rebellions, invasions, and dynastic crises. They had proven themselves unbreakable until 1521, when a 15-year-old girl with flame-colored hair and eyes like winter storms arrived in chains at the imperial harem. Her birth name had been Alexandra Anastasia Lisovska, daughter of an Orthodox priest in the small Ukrainian town of Rohatin. Her childhood had been filled with morning prayers, embroidery lessons, and dreams that never stretched beyond the village boundaries. She could never have imagined that Tatar horsemen would sweep down from the steppes, transforming her from a priest's daughter into a commodity to be sold in the slave markets of Kaffa. In those brutal markets, traders examined her like livestock, noting her pale skin, her unusual hair color, and most importantly, the fierce intelligence burning behind her eyes. Slavic beauties commanded high prices, but this girl possessed something rarer than mere attractiveness. She carried herself with a dignity that slavery had not yet broken, a quality that would prove more valuable than gold. When she reached Istanbul, the Valide Sultan Hafsa immediately recognized her potential. For months, Alexandra endured a transformation more complete than death itself. Ottoman Turkish replaced her native tongue. Persian poetry filled her memory alongside Arabic prayers. She learned to walk with the fluid grace of a trained dancer, to play instruments that could make grown men weep, and most dangerously of all, she mastered the subtle arts of seduction that turned concubines into weapons of political warfare. The day they gave her the name Hurrem, meaning the joyful one, marked not just a rebirth, but the beginning of the most calculated campaign of destruction in Ottoman history. For this teenage girl had studied the 5 sacred laws not to obey them, but to identify their weaknesses. Every smile she offered, every gesture of submission, every tear she shed in Suleiman's presence was carefully crafted ammunition in a war that would span decades. Suleiman himself was unlike his predecessors in ways that made him particularly vulnerable to Hurrem's strategy. At 26, he combined the warrior spirit of his ancestors with the refined sensibilities of a Renaissance prince. European ambassadors described him as tall and elegant, with penetrating dark eyes and an aquiline nose that spoke of noble breeding. But it was his love of poetry and philosophical discourse that provided Hurrem with her opening. While other concubines offered only physical pleasure, Hurrem presented herself as an intellectual companion, capable of discussing literature, theology, and even matters of state. She spoke to him in the language of equals while maintaining the perfect illusion of submission. In their private chambers, she would recite verses from Persian masters, offer insights into European politics gleaned from conversations with palace interpreters, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, began positioning herself as indispensable to his emotional and intellectual satisfaction. The first law she broke seemed almost accidental. In 1521, she gave birth to her first son, Mehmed. Tradition demanded that she now step aside, having fulfilled her primary function. But Hurrem had no intention of fading into the shadows of the harem. Through calculated displays of vulnerability mixed with fierce loyalty, she convinced Suleiman that their connection transcended mere physical desire. By 1522, she was pregnant again, carrying Mihrimah. Then came Selim in 1524, Bayezid in 1525, and finally Abdullah and Cihangir. Each birth represented not just another violation of sacred law, but another anchor binding Suleiman to her. While other concubines had given him one son and disappeared into obscurity, Hurrem had become the mother of his dynasty. The implications were staggering. No longer could any rival claim equal status as the mother of imperial heirs. She had monopolized the Sultan's bloodline, but Hurrem understood that children alone would not secure her position. The greatest threat to her ambitions came from within the palace itself, in the form of Hurrem Sultan, the mother of Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son and presumed heir. Mahidevran had held the position of first consort before Hurrem's arrival, and she commanded the loyalty of powerful factions within the court, who viewed the Ukrainian interloper with suspicion and contempt. The rivalry between these two women would define the next phase of Ottoman history, but it was no equal contest. While Mahidevran relied on tradition and her son's birthright, Hurrem was constructing something far more dangerous, a network of spies, allies, and informants that reached into every corner of the palace and beyond. Through carefully chosen gifts, strategic alliances, and the judicious application of fear and favor, she began building what would become the most sophisticated intelligence operation in the empire. Eunuchs who had served the palace for decades found themselves inexplicably drawn to conversations with this charming young woman who seemed so interested in their opinions. Concubines who might have been rivals discovered that friendship with Hurrem brought privileges and protections they had never imagined. Even the Janissaries, the elite military corps that had traditionally remained aloof from harem politics, began to receive subtle messages that their loyalty to the right cause would not go unrewarded. By 1530, Hurrem had achieved something unprecedented in Ottoman history. She had become not just the Sultan's favorite concubine, but his most trusted advisor on matters of state. Venetian diplomats reported with amazement that no significant decision was made without consulting the woman they had begun calling the Russian witch. French ambassadors noted that audiences with Suleiman had become meaningless unless one first secured the approval of his sultana. But Hurrem's greatest masterstroke was yet to come. For 13 years, she had been carefully, methodically destroying every obstacle to her ultimate goal. She had neutralized rivals, eliminated enemies, and positioned herself as irreplaceable in Suleiman's affections. Now, in the winter of 1533, she was ready to execute the final phase of her revolution. The preparations began in absolute secrecy, hidden even from the palace chroniclers who recorded every significant event in imperial life. What was being planned went so far beyond accepted tradition that its very existence would have triggered immediate revolt among the conservative elements of the court. For Hurrem was about to attempt something that no woman in Ottoman history had ever achieved: legitimate marriage to a reigning sultan. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. Islamic law and Ottoman tradition both explicitly forbade the marriage of a sultan to a slave. Royal weddings were reserved for foreign princesses, tools of diplomacy that cemented alliances and expanded imperial influence. But Hurrem had spent years studying these laws, searching for loopholes and precedents that might be twisted to serve her purposes. The solution she devised was breathtaking in its audacity and legal sophistication. On the very day of the wedding ceremony, she would be formally manumitted, freed from slavery by imperial decree. Technically, this would make her a free woman capable of legal marriage. The fact that her freedom would last mere hours before the ceremony transformed her into an empress was a detail she trusted would be overlooked in the chaos of celebration. But even this legal maneuvering required the cooperation of the most powerful figures in the empire, men who had every reason to oppose her elevation. Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's closest friend and most trusted advisor, had repeatedly warned against the concentration of power in foreign hands. The religious establishment viewed any deviation from traditional marriage practices as dangerous innovation bordering on heresy. Hurrem's response was characteristically ruthless and brilliantly executed. Over the course of months, she systematically eliminated every source of opposition, beginning with those closest to the Sultan himself. The elimination of Ibrahim Pasha required patience and surgical precision. For years, he had stood as the primary obstacle between Hurrem and absolute influence over Suleiman. The Grand Vizier commanded respect throughout the empire. His military victories had expanded Ottoman territory deep into Europe, and most dangerously, he possessed Suleiman's complete trust born from childhood friendship. Direct confrontation would have been suicide. Instead, Hurrem chose the slow poison of whispered doubt. She began by exploiting Ibrahim's own success against him. His victories in Hungary and his growing wealth had already sparked jealousy among other high-ranking officials. Hurrem simply amplified these existing resentments, ensuring that every slight, every perceived arrogance, every moment of Ibrahim's rising confidence reached Suleiman's ears through carefully chosen intermediaries. She never spoke against the Grand Vizier directly. Instead, she expressed concern for her beloved Sultan's safety, wondering aloud whether such a powerful minister might eventually pose a threat to imperial authority itself. The genius of her campaign lay in its indirectness. When Ibrahim constructed a magnificent palace that rivaled the Sultan's own residence, Hurrem merely mentioned how much she admired its beauty, while sighing about the burden such displays must place on the imperial treasury. When Ibrahim began signing documents with his own seal alongside the Sultan's, she praised his efficiency, while wondering whether foreign ambassadors might become confused about who truly ruled the empire. Each seed of doubt was planted with the delicate touch of a master gardener. Hurrem understood that Suleiman's love for Ibrahim ran deep, forged in the fires of shared youth and countless military campaigns. A frontal assault on this friendship would have failed spectacularly, but gradual erosion, the patient work of years, could accomplish what no single accusation could achieve. The breakthrough came when Hurrem arranged for certain documents to fall into Suleiman's hands. Letters that appeared to show Ibrahim corresponding privately with European powers, discussing terms that seemed to exceed his authority. The correspondence was expertly forged, bearing Ibrahim's authentic seal obtained through bribes to his secretaries. The content was subtle, never explicitly treasonous, but suggestive of a minister who had perhaps begun to see himself as more than a servant of the imperial will. Suleiman's reaction was everything Hurrem had calculated. The Sultan said nothing, made no accusations, took no immediate action, but the seed was planted, and she watched it grow through the subtle changes in imperial behavior. Ibrahim found himself excluded from certain private councils. His advice was sought less frequently. The warmth that had once characterized his relationship with Suleiman cooled by degrees. By 1534, the Grand Vizier's position had become precarious, though he himself remained unaware of the trap closing around him. Hurrem had achieved her goal without appearing to lift a finger against him. When Ibrahim Pasha was finally executed in 1536, strangled in his sleep by mute assassins, the official reason would be suspicion of treason. But those who understood palace politics knew the truth. The Ukrainian slave girl had orchestrated the downfall of the empire's most powerful minister. With Ibrahim neutralized and the religious establishment cowed by carefully distributed bribes and threats, Hurrem could proceed to the final phase of her revolution. The wedding preparations began in earnest, conducted under such secrecy that even today, historians struggle to piece together the exact sequence of events. What is certain is that every detail was choreographed with the precision of a military campaign. The location chosen for the ceremony violated the third sacred law with breathtaking boldness. Rather than being married in the traditional chambers of the harem, Hurrem insisted that the wedding take place within Topkapi Palace itself, in rooms where no woman had ever been permitted to reside. The justification was ingenious in its simplicity. A suspicious fire had damaged certain sections of the old palace where imperial women traditionally lived, necessitating temporary relocation to ensure their safety. Later investigations would reveal that the fire had been deliberately set, causing just enough damage to create a plausible excuse while leaving the most valuable sections untouched. But in the moment, it provided perfect cover for what amounted to a permanent conquest of spaces that had been exclusively male domains for over 2 centuries. The architectural modifications that followed were even more audacious. Working under cover of darkness, master craftsmen installed a network of hidden passages, concealed listening posts, and specially designed chambers that would allow Hurrem unprecedented access to the machinery of imperial power. Barred windows were positioned to provide sightlines into the council chambers where the empire's most crucial decisions were made. Secret doorways connected her private quarters directly to Suleiman's study, enabling consultations that could occur without any witness or record. These modifications transformed Topkapi Palace from a seat of government into something resembling a spider's web, with Hurrem positioned at the center of an intricate network of information and influence. Every conversation, every plot, every whispered conspiracy would eventually reach her ears through channels that her enemies could neither detect nor disrupt. The creation of her new title required equally sophisticated maneuvering. The rank of Hurrem Sultan simply did not exist in Ottoman tradition, but Hurrem needed something that would elevate her above every other woman in the empire, while providing legal justification for her unprecedented authority. Palace scholars were persuaded to delve into classical texts, searching for precedents that might support such an innovation. The arguments they eventually produced were masterpieces of theological creativity. Drawing on Persian traditions of royal consorts and Islamic concepts of spiritual partnership, they crafted a justification that portrayed the Haseki Sultan as a divinely ordained companion to the ruling sultan, a position that had always existed in potential but had never before been formally recognized. The title itself was a stroke of linguistic genius. Haseki derived from Persian roots meaning beloved or chosen one, while sultan carried all the weight of supreme authority. Together, they created a rank that was simultaneously intimate and imperial, suggesting both personal devotion and political power. Foreign ambassadors would spend years trying to understand the precise meaning and authority conveyed by this invented title. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Hurrem's transformation was her assumption of direct political authority. No longer content to influence Suleiman through pillow talk and private conversations, she began participating openly in imperial administration. Her network of informants and allies had grown into a parallel government that operated alongside the official hierarchy. Through carefully selected intermediaries, she began conducting her own diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers. Letters survive in European archives, showing her direct negotiations with Polish kings, Hungarian nobles, and even the Pope himself. These communications were conducted in her own name, with her own seal, asserting authority that no woman in Islamic history had ever claimed. The intelligence network she commanded rivaled anything possessed by the empire's official spies. Merchants, diplomats, provincial governors, and military commanders all found themselves subtly recruited into a web of information that flowed directly to Hurrem's chambers. She knew about rebellions before they erupted, anticipated enemy movements before they were planned, and identified threats to imperial authority before they fully formed. This transformation of a Ukrainian slave girl into the shadow ruler of the world's most powerful empire required not just intelligence and ambition, but a complete reimagining of what was possible within the rigid constraints of Islamic law and Ottoman tradition. Every step of her ascent had required the violation of customs that had seemed unbreakable, the corruption of officials who had appeared incorruptible, and the patient destruction of enemies who had commanded overwhelming advantages. As the spring of 1534 approached, Hurrem stood on the threshold of her ultimate triumph. 5 sacred laws lay in ruins around her. The empire's most powerful minister had been eliminated. The religious establishment had been bought or intimidated into compliance. The palace itself had been physically restructured to accommodate her presence at the heart of power. All that remained was the wedding ceremony itself, the final act that would transform a slave into an empress and establish precedents that would reshape Ottoman politics for centuries to come. But even Hurrem, with all her careful planning and ruthless execution, could not have anticipated the full consequences of what she was about to unleash. The night that would change everything was finally at hand. The preparations for that fateful night began with rituals no Ottoman court had ever witnessed. In the depths of Topkapi's most guarded chambers, master craftsmen worked by candlelight to transform spaces that had never known a woman's presence. Byzantine goldsmiths melted down treasures that had adorned conquered emperors, reshaping imperial regalia into ornaments worthy of this unprecedented ceremony. Persian perfumers concocted fragrances that would mask the scent of revolution with the sweetness of jasmine and rose. But these were merely the visible preparations. The true work occurred in shadows, through whispered conversations and carefully exchanged glances that would determine whether Hurrem's audacious gamble would succeed or end with her strangled body floating in the Bosphorus. Every servant, every guard, every official who might witness the ceremony had to be either bought, terrified, or eliminated. There could be no loose tongues, no horrified witnesses who might carry tales of broken traditions to the empire's distant provinces. The religious justification required the most delicate maneuvering. Islamic scholars who had spent lifetimes studying sacred texts suddenly found themselves tasked with discovering precedents that had never existed. Ancient Persian customs were resurrected and reinterpreted. Obscure hadith were examined through new lenses that revealed previously hidden meanings. The legal arguments they eventually produced would have made their predecessors weep with shame, but they served their purpose. On parchment, at least, the marriage could be defended. The date itself was chosen with astrological precision. Court astronomers, men who normally calculated the timing of military campaigns and the founding of cities, now bent their expertise to ensuring that the stars would favor this ultimate transgression. The ceremony would take place during the new moon, when darkness would conceal what daylight might have exposed to prying eyes. As the appointed night approached, Istanbul itself seemed to hold its breath. Merchants in the Grand Bazaar spoke in hushed tones about strange deliveries to the palace. Fishermen on the Golden Horn reported unusual activity in the imperial gardens. Even the city's famous cats appeared restless, as if sensing that the natural order of things was about to be shattered. Within the palace walls, the atmosphere grew electric with tension. Concubines who had once competed for Suleiman's attention now watched Hurrem with mixtures of awe and terror. Some saw in her rise the possibility of their own elevation. Others recognized that her success would render their own ambitions meaningless. The harem, once a place of predictable hierarchies and understood roles, had become a battlefield where the stakes were nothing less than the future of the dynasty. Hurrem Sultan, relegated to increasingly distant chambers, understood better than anyone what Hurrem's marriage would mean. Her son Mustafa remained the eldest prince, but legitimacy was about to gain a power that birthright alone could not match. In the darkness of her apartments, she penned letters to provincial governors who had served under her son's command, testing their loyalty, preparing for conflicts that might soon tear the empire apart. The wedding garments themselves told the story of a revolution disguised as celebration. Hurrem's dress was crafted from silk that had travelled the length of the Silk Road, interwoven with threads of gold that caught candlelight like captured stars. But hidden within the elaborate embroidery were symbols that no traditional Ottoman bride would have dared display. Slavic patterns honoured her origins, while Byzantine motifs proclaimed her conquest of the imperial capital itself. The jewels that adorned her were no less significant. Rubies that had once decorated the crowns of conquered sultans now rested against her throat. Pearls from the depths of the Persian Gulf formed cascades that fell across shoulders that had once borne the yoke of slavery. Each gem was a trophy, a tangible reminder that what had seemed impossible was now becoming reality. Suleiman himself underwent his own transformation during these final preparations. The man who had conquered Belgrade and Rhodes, who had made European kings tremble at the mention of his name, found himself nervous as any bridegroom. But his anxiety stemmed from sources deeper than mere romantic excitement. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the magnitude of what he was about to do. Every law he had sworn to uphold, every tradition that had legitimized his authority, would be violated in a single night. Yet he could not resist. Hurrem had become more than his lover, more than his advisor. She had become the mirror in which he saw his own greatness reflected. The voice that whispered possibilities he had never dared imagine. Through her, he glimpsed a future where Ottoman power was not constrained by ancient customs, but liberated to achieve heights that previous sultans could never have reached. The ceremony began at the stroke of midnight, when the palace bells tolled across a sleeping city that remained unaware of the revolution unfolding within the imperial walls. The guests were few, but carefully chosen. Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha's replacement, already selected though not yet announced, stood as witness to the destruction of his predecessor's influence. Religious leaders who had been persuaded to sanction this unprecedented union offered blessings that tasted like ash in their mouths. No chronicler was permitted to record the exact words spoken that night. The marriage contract itself would disappear from palace archives within a generation, destroyed by those who understood that some precedents were too dangerous to preserve in writing. But the fragments that survive in private letters and diplomatic dispatches paint a picture of a ceremony that was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying in its implications. The vows themselves were crafted to avoid explicit violations of Islamic law while achieving everything Hurrem desired. She was formally manumitted moments before the ceremony began, her slave chains replaced by golden bracelets that symbolized her new status. The marriage contract granted her not just the title of wife, but unprecedented authority over palace administration and imperial finances. As the ceremony reached its climax, something unprecedented occurred. Rather than the traditional pattern where the bride was presented to her husband in submissive silence, Hurrem spoke her own vows. In a voice that carried across the marble chambers, she swore not just fidelity to Suleiman, but loyalty to the Ottoman dynasty and dedication to the expansion of imperial power. Those words, spoken by a woman in a space where women's voices had never been heard, sent shockwaves through every witness. The assembled officials realized they were not merely observing a wedding, but witnessing the birth of a new form of government. The age of the Sultan's absolute rule was ending. The era of shared power had begun. The physical consummation that followed was no mere romantic culmination, but a political act of the highest significance. In chambers specially prepared with furnishings that rivaled those of Byzantine emperors, the former slave girl completed her transformation into the most powerful woman in the Islamic world. Every kiss, every whispered endearment, every moment of intimacy was simultaneously personal and political, sealing alliances that would reshape the balance of power across 3 continents. But even as Hurrem achieved her ultimate triumph, the consequences of her revolution were already beginning to unfold. In distant provinces, governors received coded messages informing them of the new reality. Some swore immediate loyalty to the Hurrem Sultan, recognizing that opposition would be futile. Others began quietly preparing for resistance, gathering forces that might eventually challenge this unprecedented concentration of power. European courts reacted with confusion and alarm as news of the marriage filtered through diplomatic channels. Ambassadors who had spent years learning to navigate Ottoman politics suddenly found their expertise worthless. The careful balance of bribes, favors, and strategic alliances that had governed international relations was now meaningless. A new player had entered the game, one whose motivations and methods remained largely unknown. The Venetian ambassador's dispatch to the Doge captured the bewilderment that gripped foreign observers. The Turk has married his Russian slave, elevating her above all his other women and granting her authority that exceeds that of many princes. What this portends for our relations with the Porte, I cannot say, but I fear that all our previous calculations must now be reconsidered. Within the palace itself, the immediate aftermath of the wedding night brought both celebration and terror in equal measure. Servants who had facilitated Hurrem's rise found themselves showered with gold and granted positions of unprecedented influence. Those who had opposed her, or who were suspected of harboring loyalty to her rivals, began to disappear with alarming frequency. The transformation of Hurrem's living quarters proceeded with breathtaking speed. Chambers that had housed the empire's most sacred relics were converted into reception rooms where she could hold court. Workshops that had produced ceremonial weapons for centuries were retooled to create furnishings worthy of an empress. The physical space of Topkapi Palace was being literally reshaped to accommodate the new reality of female power. But perhaps the most significant change was invisible to casual observers. The flow of information that had once moved through established channels now passed through networks controlled by the new Hurrem Sultan. Military dispatches were copied and delivered to her chambers before reaching the Sultan himself. Diplomatic correspondence was decoded by scholars who reported their findings to her before briefing the Imperial Council. Intelligence from across the empire's vast territories flowed into her hands with a speed and comprehensiveness that would have been impossible under the old system. The wedding night had lasted mere hours, but its effects would reverberate for generations. Hurrem had not simply married the Sultan. She had fundamentally altered the nature of Ottoman governance. The rigid separation between the harem and the halls of power had been permanently breached. The ancient prohibition against female participation in imperial administration had been swept away. Most significantly, the precedent had been established that traditional law could be bent, twisted, and ultimately broken when circumstances demanded innovation. Foreign observers struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The Ottoman Empire, which had seemed like an unchanging monolith governed by immutable religious and cultural laws, had revealed itself to be far more flexible than anyone had imagined. If a Ukrainian slave could become an empress overnight, what other transformations might be possible? What other seemingly impossible changes might this unprecedented woman engineer in the years to come? The answer to those questions would reshape not just the Ottoman Empire, but the entire balance of power in Europe and Asia. Hurrem's wedding night had not simply broken 5 ancient laws. It had opened a door to possibilities that no one, not even she herself, could fully anticipate. As dawn broke over the Bosphorus, painting the minarets of Istanbul in shades of gold and crimson, a new age began. The age of the Sultanate of women was about to commence, and its architects slept in chambers that had never before sheltered feminine dreams. But her sleep was not peaceful. Even in triumph, Hurrem understood that her greatest challenges lay ahead. The wedding night had been merely the beginning of a struggle that would determine whether her revolution would endure or be crushed by forces she had not yet learned to control. The ripples of that revolutionary night spread far beyond the marble halls of Topkapi, carrying whispers of change to every corner of an empire that stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. What Hurrem had achieved in darkness would transform how power itself was understood across 3 continents. But the true magnitude of her victory would only become clear as the months that followed revealed the systematic destruction of every obstacle that stood between her and absolute authority. The first casualty of the new order was predictable yet shocking in its swiftness. Hurrem Sultan, the Valide Sultan who had once held supreme authority over the imperial harem, began experiencing mysterious ailments within weeks of the wedding ceremony. The woman who had ruled the palace women with iron discipline found herself growing weaker by the day, her once sharp mind clouded by episodes of confusion and nausea that palace physicians attributed to natural aging. But those closest to the situation recognized symptoms that suggested a more sinister explanation. The gradual deterioration, the particular pattern of weakness and disorientation, bore the hallmarks of slow poisoning by arsenic compounds that skilled assassins had perfected over centuries of palace intrigue. Hafsa's death 6 months later removed the last figure who possessed both the authority and the will to challenge Hurrem's unprecedented elevation. With the Valide Sultan gone, Hurrem moved to consolidate her control over the vast network of women, eunuchs, and servants who comprised the palace's hidden government. Her methods were sophisticated beyond anything the harem had previously witnessed. Rather than relying solely on fear or bribery, she created a system of mutual dependence that bound her supporters to her success while making opposition both dangerous and pointless. Concubines who demonstrated loyalty found themselves elevated to positions of comfort and influence they had never imagined possible. Their families in distant provinces received unexpected gifts and protections. Their children, if they bore sons to lesser officials, discovered opportunities for advancement that would have been unthinkable under the old system. Hurrem understood that sustainable power required willing allies, not merely terrified subjects. Those who resisted faced consequences that were swift but never directly traceable to the new Haseki Sultan. Accidents befell their relatives. Mysterious illnesses struck their supporters. Financial difficulties plagued their families in ways that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than natural misfortune. The message was clear without ever being explicitly stated. Opposition to Hurrem was not merely futile, but actively dangerous to everyone connected to the would-be rebel. The eunuchs who controlled access to the Sultan found themselves particularly crucial to Hurrem's expanding influence. These men, denied the possibility of dynasties of their own, had traditionally served as neutral administrators whose loyalty belonged solely to the imperial system itself. But Hurrem recognized that their very isolation from normal human relationships made them vulnerable to different forms of persuasion. She offered them something no previous consort had ever provided: genuine respect for their intelligence and administrative skills. Rather than treating them as mere servants, she consulted them on matters of policy and finance, seeking their advice on complex problems that previous sultanas had never even acknowledged. This revolutionary approach created bonds of personal loyalty that transcended traditional duty, transforming potential obstacles into enthusiastic collaborators. And so, as the morning sun cast its first light through the windows of Topkapi Palace, a revolution that had taken 13 years to orchestrate was finally complete. Hurrem Sultan had achieved the impossible, transforming herself from a 15-year-old Ukrainian slave into the most powerful woman in the Islamic world. But her wedding night had accomplished something far more profound than personal triumph. It had shattered the very foundations upon which Ottoman imperial authority rested, proving that even the most sacred traditions could be broken by intelligence, patience, and ruthless determination. The 5 ancient laws lay in ruins, replaced by precedents that would guide the empire for centuries to come. The age of the Sultanate of Women had begun, and its architect now held the power to reshape the destiny of 3 continents. History would remember this night not as a wedding, but as the moment when the impossible became inevitable.